So one thing I did want to dive in pretty quick because I think we're doing a lot of experimentation, and we're looking at vacuum, non-vacuum, a lot of other processes, which I definitely want to talk about process um, after this. But packaging, I think, is something that I'm kind of really obsessing about at the moment in terms of efficiencies, but also sustainability. And Chris, I know you had mentioned packaging is something that you've got some insight into, which I think could be exceptionally useful for people right now when if they're assessing the scenario of whether or not to do this. What kind of avenue should we be looking at in terms of packaging for that's good for the coffee, but also we really need to dive down into that sustainability side of things as well.
Yeah, it's one of the sustainability arguments is a tough one because um, so when you think about plastic and you're thinking about the sort of the single-use vacuum seal bags that you see a lot of people using, um, they are actually from an environmental perspective, obviously very sore on the eye if it gets thrown into a landfill. But they're very cheap to manufacture. You don't use much solvent to make the plastic, et cetera. So actually, the footprint to actually make the plastic is pretty small. The footprint to make the coffee that's contained within the plastic is extremely high. So there's you have to water it at various different stages of its life. Whether that's watering it when it's brown and ground up, or watering it when it's green and still connected to a tree. And heating water is really inefficient. It's really, really expensive, in addition to flying that coffee, or moving it by boat. So I guess the point I'm getting at is from a life cycle assessment perspective, you always want to minimize any pollution that you can minimize for the environment. But if you're using plastic to protect something that had a larger carbon footprint than the plastic itself, then actually plastic is actually not the enemy here, because what would be worse is wasting the expensive product that caused a lot of CO2 to be emitted into the atmosphere. So if you could produce less geisha, for example, because you stored it in plastic, you immediately get million times more efficient to store it in plastic. And having said that, plastic looks bad when you throw it away, and so people we don't think of the enemy as CO2 because it's hard to see it. You can't see it unless it's dry ice, and then you can actually see it, obviously. But we don't think about it like that. So of course, any effort to minimize plastic waste is also just less plastic being used. So there's better technologies that exist, like for example, some of these sort of reusable vacuum sealing vessels, like silicone bags and anti-chambers that you can pump out. I think there's some companies that make products like that. That's option two. But then I was actually speaking to Kirk very recently about this, about I think what Ona actually does, which are what are essentially centrifuge vials, and you just fill them with full coffee. And the thing is, coffee actually occupies space, like physical space. And we think that there's some void space when you put a whole bunch of coffee beans in some vessel. But as long as you fill that vessel up a lot, there's not that much air left in that vessel because it's mainly occupied by coffee. So actually, you can get away with just using a vessel without even vacuum sealing. You can get away with using a vessel that is just really close to the same size as the amount of coffee you're storing.
So I've been doing that. Like that was my preparation for the World Barista Championships last year, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, you just put them in a vial that's like roughly the same size.
Yeah, so obviously did months and months of testing against vac seal bags, against test tubes, and as you're talking about, just minimal headspace, if any headspace.
Yeah.
And I still drink them today. My World's Espresso, which is 14 months later, more.
Tastes good?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, but there's obviously lots of, you can go as complicated as you want. But the question is, like, what do you have to do to get into 95% of the benefit of freezing coffee without having to go to, 99% of the cost? And I think you guys at Ona have successfully done that by just picking vials that hold the amount of coffee you want it to hold, and not much more than that. Obviously, the issue then comes in, like if you want to what if you want to hold 20 grams of Pacamara and 20 grams of maca? Like those things are real different.
You just have different sized tubes. There's plenty
of... You actually do have that?
Well, you can buy 5, 10, 15, 25, 35, 45, 50 mil tubes.
That's awesome. Well, that would be like the minimum level of, like, you'd see a benefit right away from just doing that, I think.
It seems to me that often when people vac seal things and then freeze them, they're things that have higher moisture content. Because basically what you don't want is something to get freezer burnt. So I haven't done the test, but I imagine you could get away with a decent amount of headspace. Obviously you have oxidation, but I think the thing that would kill you more is on the green side. You have to be more careful with headspace just because you have a lot more moisture moving around. Within coffee, I think the only thing you're really fighting obviously is the aging process, but then the moisture, because it's not a problem, I imagine you can get away with more headspace in a dose of roasted coffee than in a dose of green.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of testing on, I guess, coffee that's just been sitting around from World's Prep, Ben, and we have a lot, and because it's been in the freezer, and we have a lot of those as well. We can have a look at them, and I agree with you. We also found just obviously another Pandora's box with the type of coffee and how it's roasted. So the more roasted it is, the better it's able to survive.
We found that too.
Yeah.
I wondered, I don't know how much we're jumping off the topic, but I've wondered.
Sorry, I don't want to steer it away. So
yeah,
test tubes, new topic.
I guess we can come to the roast development later, maybe.
Yeah, sorry, but anyway, yeah. But just to complement we've seen that as well. Different doses, you're prepping, you do everything, and different headspaces, and things are still looking good all that time later. Yeah.
One thing I've been talking to Matt Perger about in the last few weeks is looking at actually nitrogen flushing certain vials and the practicality around doing that, and whether or not that would be, that would enable us to use whatever size vial and flush it with nitrogen and then chuck it in the freezer. Because if we're swapping out oxygen for nitrogen and having that gas, then the problem of moisture condensing inside of a vial in the freezer, my hypothesis would be it won't be a problem. So that's something I'm looking into. I'm not sure if anyone else has looked into that, but I think the only thing stopping me from doing it right now is having an actual nitrogen tap with a lid that will enable me to just remove it once it's fully flushed with the nitrogen. And that's the only barrier I've got, but good old Matthew Perg is helping me out with that one, and I'll be sure to let you all know how it goes.
Yeah, please do.
I'd love to know, Chris, your kind of thoughts on in terms of flushing and things like that, because Kirk, to your kind of point, the next thing I'm going to dive into is argon. Been playing around with argon for a while now, not just on roasted coffee, but Matt, we saw a young competitive barista do that a couple of years ago in terms of preserving batch brewed coffee as well with the argon wine savers. I've actually got some of those argon wine savers coming on the way to be able to start doing that testing between containers and bags and things like that. But Chris, I'd love to know your thoughts on the potential uses of those gases and how they would interact when frozen.
Yeah, so there are these gases that we're talking about backfilling with. The concept, just to get everyone on the same page, is you just have a vial, and you're going to pump in some gas that displaces the mixture of gases that are in air. And in the air, you have like 80% nitrogen, roughly, let's say, roughly 20 or 15% oxygen, and then the rest is, not inconsequential stuff like carbon dioxide and neon and argon to some extent and so forth. And typically when you're thinking about, and water vapor. And typically when you're thinking about backflushing, you're trying to remove any headspace gases that you think might have some negative interaction with your coffee, or anything for that matter. You could do this with hot dog if you wanted. So the first and most obvious one here is O2, because we typically think of O2 as one of the origins of oxidation. And I mean, it's not the only way something can oxidize, but it is certainly one way that can react with organic molecules through O2 oxidation. And so basically the situation you have here is, okay, can we remove O2 from the vessel to prevent oxidation? Oxidation is pretty slow. It's not a process that, depending on the molecules, but it's not a process that's super, super fast. But if you're going to keep it for a long time, it'll go to completion. By completion, I mean, if you only have 5 oxygen molecules in the vessel, you're going to only get 5 oxygen molecules worth of oxidation. As an analogy, this is well known in wine. The little heads, you pop the cork in when they're bottling, and the headspace has some amount of O2 in it. And then you can monitor the O2 content, and it drops very rapidly, like an exponent. And that's oxidation, deliberate oxidation and uncontrolled oxidation of the wine. But not the whole bottle of wine gets oxidized, only a little bit, because there's only a little bit of O2 in there. So that's the same thing with coffee in principle. In practice, it's really, really hard to monitor what compounds are being oxidized, because there's so many, and they're in relatively low concentration. It's pretty difficult to see what oxidized. So how do you overcome this problem? Obviously, is you pump in a gas that does not react. And the most obvious gas that does not react is nitrogen, actually. So N2. That's sort of a technology that we haven't, as a coffee industry, really talked about. But if you were to, for example, freeze in liquid nitrogen and then add a couple of drops as you're sealing up you're sealing up letting the nitrogen liquid turn into nitrogen gas and displace all the air. That's one way that you can actually just get a nitrogen atmosphere established pretty quick. But people don't like to play with liquid nitrogen in the cafe all that. Well, we actually do like to play with it, right? But it's just I love liquid nitrogen. I'd be like freezing all sorts of stuff.
Man, I was throwing that stuff around on stage.
That's awesome.
It was awesome. Yeah.
You can make ice cubes out of like anything with that.
It's a cool party trick too. Like when you get so comfy with it, I would just pour it over my hand in a constant stream.
Yeah.
And people are freaking out. What? And they're like, if it doesn't pull, it won't burn you. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. I love that. I love that stuff. Yeah. So nitrogen's a good example of that. There was a lot of work in chemistry has gone into reacting nitrogen to turn it into something else, because nitrogen is so inert. So, this is like serious business to try and get N2 to turn into anything. So nitrogen's fine. You can step up to the next level. You can go to helium or argon or neon or any of those sort of noble gases. And the benefit of those ones, obviously, is that they're actually relatively low density, so they actually can quickly displace a lot of air from that vessel. One of the challenges with those is they're really expensive, and that's not an economy of scale. That's not like all of a sudden you want more of it, it gets cheaper. It doesn't get cheaper. It just gets more expensive. So unfortunately those gases are difficult. So I think a lot of people are thinking about using argon as an option here. And maybe if you're dealing with like a really, really expensive coffee, maybe you'd consider it. But the benefit chemically is no different to using nitrogen gas. I mean, it's not going to react with anything. Yeah.
I'd be curious to see your findings, Kirk, as you go down this path, because the thing that I'm always curious about is the coffee exits the roaster, spends a bunch of time in a cooling tray, is in a bagging assembly line, gets bagged, comes to you. And so I wonder the net amount, to Chris's point that there's only so much oxygen in each tube, if the net amount of oxygen you're avoiding with flushing, how much that is in comparison to the life cycle of that bean once it was roasted, and how much oxygen it was exposed to. And also sort of where's the break point, because all coffee is being exposed to oxygen at some point, is where's the break point where you actually are tasting oxidation? And are you tasting oxidation, or are you actually tasting it off-gassing to the point that there's no tasty volatiles left?
Yeah, that's really the point, is that how do you know if that flavor that you don't like is just what's left after all the stuff you do like's gone.
What would be cool if you pressurized a chamber with oxygen so that the coffee couldn't off gas, and then you tasted it.
Yeah, and that's the experiment right there. Because the other one we didn't talk about it, but you guys all like, you know, Sasha does this thing with exposing the green coffee and the processing to, you know, essentially CO2 rich environments. And that gives rise to flavors people actually like somehow. So what if, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know anything about that stuff, but what about like storing it in CO2? I mean, has anyone deliberately just put it into an acidic atmosphere?
So it naturally happens a little bit, because if you let the coffee sit, it off gases and it'll sit in the chamber. But I've never seen it in I've tried storing some coffee in like siphon bottles where it's pressurized and let the pressure build up. It doesn't perform super well on the espresso side because you have higher amounts of carbonic acid because there's more CO2 in the coffee. But I never tried it on the filter side.
Doesn't Maxwell now in production have bags with no valves for roasted coffee?
Yeah, it's pretty exciting stuff by the time it gets to my house.
Yeah, so I mean that's creating an environment within the framework of what we're talking about.
Well, yeah, but that is limited. The amount of CO2 in that is limited by how much was in the coffee, not by pumping in a bunch of like pure CO2.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying you should do this. This is just totally crazy.
Chris, they were gonna see a bunch of like weird experiments after Chris has said all this and it gets public, and people blowing up jars by putting liquid nitrogen.
Yes.
Yeah, that is definitely going to happen.
Yeah, you've just made some bombs, Chris.
Yeah, that's fine.
Let's everyone make sure that we can all do our experiments in a safe environment. On that note, the whole container thing. So my coffees for WBC in 2018, because I was very conscious about traveling from New Zealand over to Amsterdam. We're in the coffee vat containers, but at that point, I had done some testing versus the valved and non-valved containers, and the non-valved containers actually won in terms of flavor. So for me, that was a big point in utilizing that for competition, for that packaging to make sure that my coffees were surviving the travel. But in saying that, I revisited that last year when I was coaching Dove, who won New Zealand comp, and ended up going for the valve containers because the coffees that he had actually aged a lot better in that kind of environment. So yeah, a lot of it could be roast and particular coffee dependent as well.
We found the same thing when we did certain things with other people for different purposes. Another year on, we roast differently. We have different coffee, and things that didn't work in terms of packaging. So,
well, especially with roast, it's been massive. At the moment we're doing all of our espresso frozen in the tubes, in the centrifuge tubes, and which is working, as we were saying before, working very well. We've actually not been able to achieve that with our filter coffee just yet. So actually in our shops, our filter roasts don't hold up nearly as well as espresso or milk. And that's obviously that's how we roast. That's might be much to say that it can't work. No one's filter coffee will work, but certainly, how we roast all of our coffees are roasted off a drum roaster, but our espresso and milk coffees are more developed, more time in the roaster, more CO2 produced. They work better in those tubes, whereas our filter coffee, we're finding we have to fill vacuum pack completely. Similar to even the grinding process, Matty, I don't know if you remember, both me and Matt had some amazing results about 2 years ago. Double grinding with coarse grind, remove the chaff, and then vacuum pack that.
Yeah.
For espresso. And then when it was time to make that coffee, we would cut the bag that was open, cut the bag open with the pre-ground coffee, and grind it again. And that actually works for espresso. I mean, we had some amazing espressos during that approach. And I recently tried that with filter coffee, coarse grind, and then backpack. Have it really nicely prepped, all the chaff removed. But then when I went to open up that coffee and grind it and brew it, it seemed to just not work.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, let's. Sorry, Gus. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I'm not sure. I wish I knew exactly what that is. Obviously, there must be something to do with. I wonder, is it to do with the CO2 produced from that style of roast? And CO2 to a certain extent can help protect the coffee and preserve the coffee. Is that why, or what else is playing on the results there?
What do you think, Chris, when you essentially take a bean and break it up and through that process expose the release of whatever's inside of it, and then try and freeze it down in essentially smaller fragments, if you will? What's happening there?
Not much. There's not much different about, from a chemical perspective, if you break the bean open. From a kinetics perspective, and it's just the same problem of off-gassing and all these other standard processes we talked about, oxidation, all this stuff, all now have way more surface to interact with. But kind of what I guess we were all talking about at the beginning is maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's hard to know when a coffee is going to taste optimal. And you kind of arrive at it empirically. That's kind of the challenge. If you think about this from a from a coffee perspective, it's already difficult because you're like, okay, I want to serve this coffee and make sure it's the best it could ever taste. So you're at a philosophical crossroad. Well, from a chemistry perspective, it's sort of the same problem, but on a really small scale. It's like, I want to know what the molecules are going to look like. What is the nature of the molecules in 10 hours after exposure to O2? It's like, how the heck are we going to know that? I mean, it's not like they have a mouth they can tell you where they're going. They just go, and so it's really, really hard to predict what's going to happen from the chemistry perspective in food. Yeah, I can't share my screen. Actually, I have a great photo. John, you want to let me share my screen?
We'll do that.
The little green button that says share screen. You can say there's like a little arrow next to it that allows you to share.
Gotcha.
And you say permissions, and you can tick a box saying anyone.
How's that look?
Yeah, beautiful. I want to share a picture that I snapped when I was in Ona. It's like one of my favorite photos of all time in coffee. This is out the back of Ona. We've got the.
Oh no!
Yeah, so I showed this obviously, and everyone was. It's like, you can't have the geisha next to the shrimp. But
that doesn't look like. I think you were okay. That doesn't look like a geisha.
It's
down
not.
to the bottom.
No, yeah, it's
Alex
something.
Mervin's going to make some Gao-G dumplings after work or something.
So even better than this, it's like, so I said this. I showed this photo to Sam, and he was not delighted about it. But the rationale was that this bread's gluten free, so you should be right.
I'm going to roast them so hard over that.
Should we check with Sash? Do I need to edit that part out?
No, I'll leave it in.
You just censor it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Leave it in. I mean, why does it matter if it's frozen? If it's frozen, if the bags are working, you should be able to put it next to anything.
That's a good test, actually, to make sure they're working.
Yeah, I mean, except for with some of the coffees at Ona, you're like, maybe the shrimp.
But then again, in coffee, do we need another variable for people to poke at?
Chronic maceration.
Yeah,
right. Exactly.
But John, with your packagings, I think we've established that depending on the coffee selection, how you're roasting and all those elements, the packaging may or may not work in terms of preservation. But what have you found recently with your exploration, John Gordon, with your exploration recently on packaging experiments and things that, because when it comes down to it, it needs to be affordable, sustainable,
Not
reusable,
tedious.
right?
Efficiency, which is the next thing that I want to get onto. But the tests are starting between the usual, vacuum, the plastic bags that we've been talking about and that we've just seen in Chris's photo, to silicone bags, to foil bags. So one thing Sash had kind of said to me about freezing the green was making sure that I had the right foil bags for the green as well, to protect the green. At the moment, the only thing that I do know that in terms of vacuuming for me has been setting. I've got a chamber vacuum. Is actually setting the chamber vacuum to the lowest setting. The highest setting, so the most vacuum seems to pull a lot more out of the coffee when you eventually get to use it.
How long do you hold it under vacuum for?
So my machine, the only settings that I've got, it's between 20 and 30 seconds. So I set it to the lowest, which is 20 seconds, and the highest, or maybe it's 35 seconds actually. But the highest setting seems to pull a lot more out of the coffee from my side.
So then when you cut it and use it, it collapses under the...
big time, on the highest setting,
Yeah, I
Whereas
found
when you
similar,
cut
actually.
Yeah, too much reverse or negative pressure impact.
So when I do, I don't have any around, but when I do the 20-second vacuum and you cut it open, there's not that collapse, and you can slightly move the coffee around in the bag a little bit more. But it's an interesting process. But the next step is when the argon does arrive, is just actually going between, because like a 20-gram dose in that at the moment there's quite a bit of space in there. These do work in the vacuum chamber to be able to push the air out and then seal it with the little Ziploc things. But still a lot of testing to be done there.